Good morning. Let's begin with a verse from James chapter 1. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Shall we pray? Lord, through the knowledge of the life of Christ, we see the perfect example of perseverance. May his life be recognized in trials and errors. Any announcements? Flash one. Forget what I said about the service for Eugene McGrath and look at my email this morning. It's on Friday, not on Saturday. And I knew that. Okay. Any other announcements I need to share? It is Friday. Definitely Friday. 2 o'clock in the sanctuary. Any other news? News got members? Okay, we are really sufficient. Well, we have to. That would be wonderful. Okay. I was going to say that the election takes a few days later. If Sarah will have it, that would be wonderful. There's also a roll up here. Okay. And it would be lovely if you would check the names off. I put a few in there, but the early words. But if you would check your own name, that would be very nice. I can remember who is here. Obviously, we're so lucky to have Sandie. And we're also fortunate that maybe she really likes so much better than football. Maybe not to be saying like it's me. But let's take it a little bit, Sandie.
Yesterday morning at the farmers market. We were out of last week. Again, because my students were all so upset last week about the big loss. And then this morning, I checked the score yesterday. So then this morning I turned on NBC News and boom, it is on the 8 o'clock Today Show with everybody in King Street. Needless to say, I'm not expecting a whole lot of papers to come in today. I think my students are going to want a holiday. One of my colleagues posted that they should have, Monday should be a holiday, all students should get A's, and we should all get raises. There you go. I'm glad to be here. I feel a little bit together than I usually am. I woke up Wednesday morning on my way to open my closet. Something doesn't smell right, and I have a roof leak. So my entire, you guys know me, so you'll appreciate this. My entire master closet is in my dining room right now, stacked up. And so for those of you who know me, you know how many pairs of shoes, how many dresses, how many tops, that actually is. So hopefully the chaos will hand in a day or two. I think we've got it fixed. Now it's just repaired. So needless to say, I've been writing this week. And after last week's class, I recognized that by starting with the murmuring or the complaining story, I really failed to communicate what I wanted to you about the context for the kind of work I want to do this week. So I'm going to go back into Tim, like this is our first week, and give you sort of the introductory piece that I think will be helpful along the way. While I was struggling with how to do that, Queen Elizabeth. And so I connect these two things because when she died, I found in all of the reflections on her life exactly the kind that I needed. You might wonder why. Well, the lady this one. Even though Queen Elizabeth lived thousands of years after the wilderness wandering period, as well as thousands of years from the time that these stories were written and edited, she's relevant because that time for Israel was a very difficult moment of transition in the same way that her death has launched the United Kingdom into a transitional moment. In betwixt and between eras, in times of profound change, there often has to be a reevaluation or a reconceptualization of who you are as a people, as a nation. And that frequently is done by drawing on the past to move to the future. The British people are going to be baptized now. I was really interested. I went back and listened to King Charles III. I'll never be used to saying that. His inaugural address in Providence. And what he understood is exactly what I'm talking about. Because he talked about how having a monarch on the throne for 70 years was really a definitive end of an era when she dies. Because even though the country has undergone profound shifts during her reign, and the Commonwealth has undergone profound shifts during her reign, her passing brings into focus a lot of questions about the relevance of the monarchy, for instance, to contemporary England, about what the modern state is, about the relationship of church and state. For the king is head of the Church of England, and I don't know if you've heard it, but we had to talk about we're now people of many faiths. He was very intentional about that. So he acknowledged on Friday some of these things, including the fact that a lot of people in the Commonwealth, let me put two things. Outside of England and the Commonwealth, a lot of people are not so interested in being part of the Commonwealth anymore. You may remember back in the spring when William and Kate took a trip to Jamaica. They didn't go so it was very rocky politically. But then inside the kingdom, there's a generation of God. Older folks are really feeling these laws, it's a different generation that doesn't relate in the same way. That same kind of reflections on current political realities, where things are headed, is where the wilderness wandering story comes from. Now, I'm going to choose my words carefully. I'm going to read my words. I have a lot of time crafting this next sentence to get it clear. These stories, in the form we have received them, were largely composed and edited in the format we have more than 1,000 years after the time they purport to depict. Now, I'm going to take that statement apart. The telling of this part of Israel's story was largely pulled together by a priestly group in Israel's post-exilic experience. That fact doesn't mean that the narrative is unrelated to history, that it doesn't pull from stories and traditions that are far older than the post-exilic period. But it does mean that even if older resources are used to tell the story, it would be like writing right now in 2022 the history of North America before the Vikings got here in 1000. That's a long time ago. Lots of water that had gone under the bridge in the intervening time. In the case of Israel, the wilderness stories were composed and pulled together in the form we have them after they had come into the land, after they had gone through a series of governments and then eventually developed a monarchy, after that monarchy had divided into two countries, after the northern kingdom fell, and then the southern kingdom fell, after Jerusalem had been destroyed, after the temples had been raised to the ground, after they had gone into exile, after some of them had come back and the temple had been in some form rebuilt. All of that came before these stories were pulled together in the form of capital. The crisis of the destruction and the exile and the subsequent allowance by the Persians of people to return and the support the Persians gave to a priestly community in a province they now call Yehud. That was their version of Judah. And it was their administrative district, and they appointed a governor who was Zerubbabel and a high priest, and supported the development of the priesthood. And then you know, eventually, you'll remember the story of people like Ezra and Nehemiah. They come back, they build this place back, they build the walls around the city again, right? All of those things happen. That was the generation that pulled together these stories. And that generation has its own contemporary interests that are stamped on these wilderness wandering stories. At the time, the people were in a metaphorical wilderness. And many of their number continued to live in far-flung places. And they wanted to keep an idea alive of this people and of this God in relationship to this people. And I want to show you how they did it and how the book of Numbers contributes to that. So let me go back and talk about that. The book of Numbers is what we call. It's named that way in English because we follow the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that Greek translation calls this book arithmoi, which means counting. And that's because a lot of counting goes on in this book. People are the number one thing that is counted or enumerated. The text begins with one sentence and close to the end, another one comes. And both of those counts are about men who can be in the army. Take a census of the whole congregation of the Israelites in their clan by their ancestral houses, according to the number of men, each male, ladies, individually, from 20 years old and up, everyone in Israel able to go to war. You and Aaron will enroll them company by company. It's almost the exact wording at the end. But that is just the beginning of the counting. By chapter 3, there's a counting of the Levites, those responsible for taking care of the tabernacle, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and carrying its vessels. They couldn't go to war, so they have to count them separately. They don't just count the Levites, however, they count them in 3 groups. The Kohathites, they are a subgroup responsible for the most sacred vessel. Then they count the Gershonites, and then the Merarites. All of them have very specific duties. What I want to say to you here is that when we go back as scholars and look at those texts, nobody takes those numbers as historically accurate. They are ideological or theological numbers, just like they are ideological or theological names that are put in these orders. Now, people can get real upset about this, so let me just give you an exact or a helpful hint. You know how the Gospel of Matthew opens with the genealogy of Jesus, and the Gospel of Luke has 1, 2, and chapter 3, and they're different. And they're different because the one in Matthew is a theological genealogy, so is the one in Luke. The one in Matthew is every generation. And it gets you from Abraham to David, from David to exile, from the exile to Christ. And if you do the math, it just doesn't work. And they throw some women in there too. And in Luke, they want to take you all the way back to Adam because it's the universal message. Genealogy is frequently theological in the Bible, and this is no exception. This counting is theological counting. But these myths still may have historical elements, and they are most interesting to us as scholars because they reveal a lot about the post-exilic period and who's counted in past. And how you find that out, you compare what's in Numbers to what's in
Chronicles, first 8 chapters of genealogy, 9th chapter is who was in Jerusalem. Ezra chapter 2 is the comparative, Ezra chapter 8. This is the priestly group forging the identity of who is Israel in the post-exilic period. And it's back in Numbers 2. Now, all that in mind, I have to have a little frank observation. If you read this book in Hebrew, its name is not a written boy or a number. You know what it is? The tradition in Hebrew is named after the first sentence. So it's called Bar Midbar, in the wilderness. That's the name of the book in Hebrew. So that's how it locates the reader, not in counting or census taking or measurement, but locating Israel in a space. And I use space instead of place intentionally, because it's creating this world of wilderness as a space. I say that because of this. When you read Numbers, you can read a lot of place names. The wilderness of Sinai, the wilderness of Zin, Hamel. I mean, there's just place names after place names. No matter who tries to do it, if you try to go back and figure out where all these places were, and what that journey would look like, it never comes out right. Because, again, it was written 1,000 years later, and they pulled together a lot of stories, and it makes no sense. What they are talking about was it was a long time for us to come into the land and to figure out how to build our lives there. And they are talking here that that work is still ongoing. And so when we talk about this as a space, we are talking about social relationships and cultural markers that orient Israel in a particular way. Now, with all of them, I would say this. When we live in unsettled times, as most of us know, or when nations find themselves in discomforting and unusual places, organization and ritual can help you exert some control. Think about it when you travel. When do you feel you're most unmoored? For most people, it's when you can't do the things that you're accustomed to doing, right? So if you have those few little touchstones of home, you're like, I'm good. I know how to do my life. But most people, when they're on the road, are very anxious to get back. I just miss my routine, people will say. I don't feel as in control of my life as I do when I'm in my community. So organization and ritual are important. So a couple of things in this book help make the point about what the post-exilic community saw as so important in the wilderness period that it told the story in the way that they did. So I'm going to talk about 3 things here. Now I'm talking about that a lot of times. First of all, these texts offer a clear sense of what it should be that orients the people of Israel in all times and in all places. They have a very clear sense of if you're feeling lost, if you're feeling scattered, if you're feeling not at home, here's what should orient you. Chapter 2, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, the Israelites shall camp each in their respective regiments under ensign by their ancestral houses. Listen to this. They shall camp facing the tent of meeting on every side. What's the tent of meeting? That's where the ark is. That's where God is, right? That's where God's presence is. They shall encamp with a tent of meeting in the middle and there on every side. No matter where they are, they're supposed to be oriented with God in the middle. You see what they're creating right there? In the post-exilic era, only a handful of people who had once been living in Israel come home. Most of the generation had passed. I mean, for a lot of people, Israel, Jerusalem, the temple, that was your parents and your grandparents' generation. You've never lived there. You've never known it. That wasn't your reality. And the geopolitical reality that they existed in, with the Persians in control, even though the Persians responsible for the building or rebuilding of the temple, wasn't going to change anytime soon in the name. But what the Persians did allow is a full priestly group to evolve around the temple and to care for the temple. But those priests were smart. They knew that the average person of Israel might never see that temple. And live all over the Mediterranean basin. So they also had to figure out how to create a system where you still felt a part of a community, even if you were never in Jerusalem. Even how you carried that with you, how you carried that identity alongside. What was important to that was the tabernacle. They didn't talk about the temple in this period as much. They wrote a story that harkened back to the tabernacle. Now, if you read the story of the wilderness in Exodus, the tabernacle is really, really elaborate. I mean, a lot elaborate. Way more elaborate than anything they could have carried in the historical era that we're talking about. It's not that there wasn't a tent in that historical times, but this is a way more elaborate tent. Because it's a tent that reflects all of the time that's passed between then and now, and it's serving this purpose. And the tabernacle was important to them because while a temple is just in one place, a tabernacle is portable. It's telling you God can be anywhere. Where the law is, where the ark is, where the community is. That's a big shift in message. What it meant is that they can remain oriented to the worship of God, to being the people of God in their ancestral house, no matter where they are. The temple was just one representation, and it was built by human hands. So this tabernacle is more where God and human history overlap. Did you know that in the post-guilt period is when synagogues were built? That was because they recognized they needed a place to gather in all these far-flung locations and study and be the people of God. That was a version of their portable tabernacle. You might be interested to know that the Christian tradition does the exact same thing with the tabernacle tradition. Anybody ever read Hebrews chapter 8? In the book of Hebrews, Jesus is talked about as our great high priest. Listen to this. We have such a high priest, the one who's seated on the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the sanctuary, that's the Greek word for tabernacle, at the true tent of the Lord, and the true tent that the Lord, not any mortal, has set up. Then it goes on to talk about how he offers sacrifices, and it says, now if he were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest at all, because there are already priests here on earth. They are for worship in the sanctuary that is a sketch and a shadow of the heavenly one. Just as Moses was warned when he was about to erect the tent, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you. See, what they're saying is the temple on earth is just built on the heavenly pattern, that the real temple or tabernacle is the cosmic one. And that cosmic one is portable. And that's what the king evokes here in the tabernacle tradition. That God can go anywhere and be everywhere.
Number two, these texts offer a remedy for what it means to live in spaces where it is difficult to live out your life in relationship to God. Just stop and think about how tough it was for the Jewish community. They live as minorities everywhere in the world that they reach. Everywhere. And so one of the things that made that really difficult was their very distinctiveness, not only set them apart for service to God, but it also made them easy to target, right? I mean, you go anywhere in the world today, tour Europe, and there were Jewish ghettos all over the place. That's where the Jews live, that's where they are, it's easy to spot because they have dietary customs and worship practices that made them distinct. And so, in Numbers 5, something interesting happened. It said the Lord spoke to Moses saying, command the Israelites to put out of the camp everybody who has a defiling skin disease or discharge, or who is unclean through contact with a corpse. You shall put out those male and female outside the camp, so they will defy the camp where I live. And you think, what does skin diseases and contact with a dead body have to do with what's talking about? For people who live away from the land, away from the temple, it was really difficult to keep alive these traditions and practices that made them different. And when that difficulty set in, this text is reminding them that there is a clear separation or distinction between who's in and who's out. And just because you live far away doesn't have to mean that you're outside of the camp. Being outside of the camp is more about, do you not live in a way that is responsive to the law? Let me show you how important this is. Numbers chapter 9 is about Passover, the commemoration of the people's deliverance from slavery and freedom, and into relationship with God. And this is the one holiday they are told they have to keep in the spirit. But it just so happens, some people who felt they were unclean come to Moses in this story, and they say, hey, we were either unclean or we were on a journey when the Passover was practiced. So what do? And Moses said, goes to God, God comes back and says, any of you or your descendants who is unclean through touching a corpse, that is being in contact with things that are dead, not the living reality of this community, or is on a journey away, shall keep the Passover to the Lord. It doesn't matter. If you're away, no matter what, you keep the Passover. And then it goes on to say, and if you don't keep the Passover, that's what puts you outside of the kingdom. What they're being told clearly is that no matter where you were, even if you felt like you were struggling to still be seen as in the camp, you needed to mark the Passover, because the liberation of God was ongoing, present, real, even if you felt outside of it. Everybody still was to believe that they were being brought from bondage to freedom. There is this hope that God is still working with this community. And that's what's most important about the third thing I want to talk about. These texts really ultimately are about one thing. God is always there, even in the wilderness. One of the most amazing images from the wilderness tradition is the fire and the cloud. And you remember that? When you have this tabernacle, it says, on the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant.
And from evening until morning, it was over the tabernacle, having the appearance of fire. It was always so. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. It is the enduring idea that wherever people keep the worship of God, wherever they are oriented towards this kind of meeting, wherever they are located in the world, God is present with them. Even more, God is guiding them in this wilderness. This is my favorite passage of any one I will talk about this morning. And I'm going to read it from the Bible. It's so great. Whenever the cloud, it says, this is Numbers 9 again, lifted over from the tent, the Israelites would set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there they would camp. At the command of the Lord, the Israelites would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. And as long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. Now listen to this verse. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the Israelites would keep the charge of the Lord and would not set out. You hear it? Even when the cloud was over and said, stay put for many days. It goes on. Sometimes the cloud will remain a few days, according to the command of the Lord. Sometimes the cloud will remain just from evening till morning, and then they would set out. Whenever whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time, that the cloud continued over the tabernacle, resting on it, the Israelites would remain in camp and wouldn't set out. God telling the people in exile, I'm going to be there. And I'm in that tabernacle dwelling, and when it's time to move, you'll move. You're finding it. It could be a day, it could be a couple of days, it could be a few months, it could be however long. You're where you are. Be there, don't move. This is the consistent message in the post-exilic period, by the way. A pretty consistent message from Haggai, from Zechariah, from Ezra, from Nehemiah, from Malachi, and these are all post-exilic voices. And they're all saying, Jeremiah, for goodness sakes, Jeremiah even had it. Make your homes, plant your gardens, feed your people there. Let them have it. No student no longer can be there. Build your life. I can be there too. They don't know how long they're going to be there. But when it's time to move, they'll be notified. They'll be made aware. Now I want to stop for a second before I put it all together and say this. That's a tough frame for a lot of people to get. And it's tough because we are so accustomed to reading the Bible as straight history rather than as one period reflecting back on another. But when you read it the way that I'm suggesting that we read Numbers, it's how it stays alive for all these generations coming forward. Because generations of the people of Israel were going to have to struggle with the same issues that the post-exilic priests were struggling with. How do you help the people living all over to feel as if they are still a part of this people in this camp, this cosmic camp that is bigger than anything that they can see? How do you attract them, a younger generation, into that life? How can they find continuity, a place to be a part of this story? Rashi, who is a medieval Jewish commentator, talks about the census in Numbers, and he makes the final point that I want to make today. You may know that in Jewish communities that there's this uncomfortableness with being counted, even when they're trying to get the minyan for prayer. And that ties back to, one time David wanted to do a census of the people and there was a plague and it was all uncomfortable. So, it's like you're uncomfortable counting. But this book is all about counting and enumerating and making sure that everyone is numbered. So this is what Rashi said when he's talking about the census and numbers. He said, because they, the children of Israel, are dear to God, God counts them often. God counted them when they were about to leave Egypt. God counted them after the golden calf to establish how many stayed faithful and were left. God counted them after God, and now let me get this out. God counted them often. He counted them when they were about to leave Egypt. God counted them after the golden calf. And now that God's presence was about to rest on them with the tabernacle, God counted them again. It's a reminder that not one was going to be lost. God was counting. God was naming. God was numbering. The book of Numbers in the wilderness was letting the people know that even though they may not be right there at home, they weren't out of God's sight. They weren't out of God's book. They weren't out of the number. The book of Numbers, or the book of In the Wilderness, is all about being in a difficult place because it is forged in a time of great transition and difficulty. The people literally is trying to figure out a way to survive and move forward in circumstances that are quite challenging. I mean, how do you reconstitute a nation of people when you don't have land, when you don't have political autonomy, when you don't even have the resources to bring them all back to one place? How do you make them feel like they're a community? I mean, we struggled with that not too long ago, didn't we? When we couldn't be in this building, how did you still make people feel connected to it? We're still struggling with that. It is about orienting them in two ways. The first is to make order out of what feels like chaos. Count them, private and ancestral houses. Let's make sure that you're on the roll and we know where you fit into the scheme of things. But the second is orienting their vision to something that could otherwise be hard to see or to feel. I quote Frederick Buechner a lot. He died a couple of weeks ago at age 96. Had a long, full, happy life. They called him in one of his obituaries the minister's theologian. And I think that's true, minister's theologian. He said this. He said, to be commanded to love God that long, let alone in a wilderness, is like being commanded to be well when you are sick, to sing for joy when you are dying of thirst, to run when our legs are broken. But this is still the first and great commandment nonetheless. Even in the wilderness, especially in the wilderness, you shall love God. What the book of Numbers is trying to do is show a tired, dispirited, and often grumbling group of how to stay in relationship to God. Hopefully, when we understand the context of its writing, when we can begin to grasp why having a clear orientation toward God is the way they chose, and why keeping norms and traditions with thread to be sure that God was always present among them, counting, even when we might not feel like we were being seen, we can get some sense of what they were trying to communicate. It's a message for that time and place, for certain, but I hope you'll agree it's a message we all need to hear in our time and our place. Anybody got questions?
Did you see the note on the? Oh, you must see that. Okay. That's a little. Now, people, she can put it in.
Anybody else? Did I lose you today?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was really wrong. I think I understand what he is talking about. That's a word you like. You can pull things together. I mean, you can do that. Well, it doesn't say anything. I mean, one of the things I really hope that you carry away from this morning is not just the three sort of theological things, which I always try to say, well, you know, good God help with that. But just in terms of history, it's to understand that the pulling together of this text has a really dynamic history. And that, to me, one of the great miracles of why the Bible survives in the form that it does, why our tradition has survived, is because the people in really difficult circumstances always manage to figure out a way to keep going forward. You know, when they lost the temple and when it fell, when the exile happened, that could have been it. Easily. Everything would have collapsed at that point. People could have said, our God got beaten, we're all one dead. You know, we're going to the Babylonians. We're going to make our lives out there and get time. These people, even though, and what was reading about this is even though it was written by priestly circles, and we know this is the post-exilic period, which goes into what we call the second temple period, which is the period where Jesus lived. Right? Jesus knows the second temple. And you know that in the life of Jesus, that second temple is full of competing Jewish groups, right? For who's worshiping right, and what's the right way to be Jewish, and what's the right way to live, and all of this, and he's another voice in that. But the second temple in 70, a few years after he stopped, one generation later, 40 years after the fall, temple stopped. Christianity didn't die, Judaism didn't die, because the brilliance of those priests was they didn't put all their eggs in the temple basket. They knew at this time and in this place that the tradition in Jerusalem was important, that the temple continued going. But for all those communities out there, the Temanite were still in the kingdom. One of the greatest poetic passages about this is about the walls in Jerusalem. And you know, Nehemiah rebuilt actual literal walls. But one of the prophetic passages says the walls are as big, have a ring of fire, and they go out all over the world. So there's not embracing anywhere you are, we're still protecting you. They understood then that they couldn't make it all about Jerusalem and the temple, because that wasn't the moment anymore. And it's one of the reasons that tradition has managed to survive when so many other traditions fail. I just think so exciting. Yeah. What is it before the time of the gardens? Man. Why don't I have a long myself? Anybody?
Thank you so much, Sandy. And I think this is something we really need to take into consideration when we are evaluating our own church as we look forward to our own 200th anniversary, 1824, 2024. So think about it. I'm going to close very quickly with an Irish blessing. May God give you for every storm a rainbow, for every cheer a smile, For every care, a promise, and a blessing in each trial. For every problem life sends, a faithful friend to share. For every sigh, a sweet song, and an answer to each prayer. Go with me.